Hello, this is Michael Otum, and I'll be delivering this podcast on protected area reserve design based on a lecture which was put together by Dr. Ellie Devonish Nelson, and it's part of the BIOL 6208 Conservation and Management of Tropical Biodiversity. Pause for an appreciation of the Gary Larson comment there. Okay. So during this lecture we'll go through some of the design principles of protected areas. We'll take a look at how island biogeography theory, or IBT, informed the design principles for protected areas. And then we'll take a look at some of the disruptive theories of single large or several small, debate on how protected areas should be designed. And then we'll take a look at metapopulation theory and how that has influenced protected area design since the late 1980s. Finally, we will take a look at reserve networks design and selection as opposed to individual reserves. We'll look at networks of reserves. And finally, we'll take a look at some of the advances in reserve selection. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because it is a very long lecture and you have other things to do with your time, so I want to get through this pretty quickly. Alright, so design principles of reserves, the 4 R's: representation, resiliency, redundancy, and reality. Okay, so when we're looking at conservation of biodiversity, quite often we focus, particularly when we're looking at in situ biodiversity conservation, which is conserving biodiversity in place, we tend to look at things like species richness as a way of representing whether our reserve is good or not. And that goes back to looking at conservation triage and trying to decide which areas to conserve and so on. So if we try and conserve the maximum number of species, we are getting the biggest bang for our conservation buck, and we are also trying to capture as many species which may be of conservation concern as possible. So that's where representation comes in. So we try and design our reserve such that all conservation units are represented in the reserve, or the maximum number of conservation units, which could be species or populations of those species, are represented in the reserve. Secondly, the reserve needs to be resilient. By resilient, it means that the reserve is able to survive perturbations, catastrophic events, whether they be called stochastic events or catastrophic events, it doesn't really matter, but they must be able to survive that. And one of the best ways of being able to do that is being large enough. If you're large enough, then one part of the reserve may be disturbed either by a fire or by drought or something like that, and the other part of the reserve still survives, and better than that, is able to recolonize the disturbed part of the reserve. So resiliency is also an important part of reserve design, and quite often that tends to be whether the reserve is large enough or not. Redundancy, the reserve needs to be large enough, or needs to be able to protect sufficient examples of each species to ensure a long-term existence of that species or unit of conservation. So what that means is basically, is the population of the species in question large enough to be able to survive into the future? So it speaks to things like minimum viable population size. If the reserve simply doesn't contain enough of enough individuals of that particular species, then it's not going to conserve that species. So the reserve must hold enough individuals or populations of those species to be able to show redundancy. So if some of those individuals or species are damaged or lost, then the others will be able to ride to the rescue and recolonize the areas. And probably the fourth and probably the most important design principles is reality. Funds and political will must exist to acquire and manage the reserves. So this is a very important part of reserve design, and quite often, unfortunately, it does tend to override all the other three design principles. That's representation, resiliency, and redundancy, which are all based on biological and ecological aspects. The reality is where the socioeconomics comes in, and unfortunately, quite often, socioeconomics overrides everything else. So we need to ask particular questions when we design our reserves to meet those 5R, 4R principles. We need to talk about size, shape, connectivity, how many species, how many individuals of those species. So species refers to representation, individuals refers to redundancy, and then finally reality. So let's talk about size, shape, and connectivity first of all. Really the first time that people started to bring biology and ecology into reserve design was when Jared Diamond in 1975 proposed a list of determinants or design principles for protected areas. So he proposed 6 design principles from ecological theory, which would make reserves more biologically and ecologically sound. Now, you've got to remember before this, well, you probably wouldn't know, but before this, protected areas were really designated and designed much more based on the fourth principle, the reality principle, and basically what areas were available for conservation of biodiversity and what areas were acceptable to the public. Okay, so Jared Diamond was then trying to bring some science, some ecological science, into what was previously very much a socio-economic means of setting the boundaries or setting the positions of protected areas around the world. So some of the iconic protected areas, say in the States, for instance, like Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park, they were not really established with any sort of ecological theory, but principally through reality or socioeconomic theory, where land was available for these reserves, and that's where they were established. So this injection of ecological theory into the design of reserves precipitated a debate, and it's known as the SLOSS debate, or single large or several small reserves. So this debate was based on ecological theory. Jared Diamond proposed certain ecological factors be prioritized, and the the several small principles advocated priority to other ecological theories. And that debate has gone on for more than a decade. Now, I want you to realize that these debates are based mainly on ecological principles. and they don't really take into account reality and socio-economic principles. And it does seem that even today, in many areas, for instance in Trinidad, where new reserves are being proposed, it does tend to hinge more on what society wants rather than what is ecologically the best thing for conserving biodiversity. All right, so Diamond's design principles are there, 6 of them. Large reserve is best. Small reserves are not so good. Single large reserve is preferable to several small totaling the same area, mainly for the reason that there is less edge effect. Okay, so a reserve sits in a landscape and there may be factors or ecological processes on the edges of those reserves which are bad for the reserves the species within the reserves. Okay, so the idea is that, the idea is that a single large reserve would tend to have less problems from edges than a small reserve, than several small reserves. If you must have small reserves, they should be grouped closely together. And the reserves should be in a cluster rather than linear, and they should be connected with corridors to aid dispersal. There are also compact shapes, not irregular shapes, to reduce edge effects. So these were design principles which were proposed with the idea that ecology should play a role in the design of reserves, and that makes sense. A lot of these principles were based on the theory of island biogeography, or the IBT. So Diamond's design principles were basically based on the theory of island biogeography, and that involves the number of species mainly on an island. So the theory of island biogeography was proposed to explain the numbers of species which are going to exist on a particular island based on how big that island is and how far away from a mainland it is. So based on whether it has, the size of the island is going to have an impact on the number of species going extinct on the island, and the closeness of the island to the mainland is going to have an effect on the number of species which colonize or recolonize that island over time. I'm not going to go into this too much because I think you need to go away, and if you don't know about the theory of island biogeography, you need to go away and learn about it. If you ask me, I'll be able to provide you with some references. So, island biogeography theory, or IBT, states that large islands are better because extinctions are less frequent, mainly because for any one species on a large island, it would have a larger population size than on a small island. So if you have a larger population size, more individuals of that species, then they're less likely to go extinct. So large islands also would tend to be more diverse, okay, because they would tend to have a greater number of species, and those species would resist extinction more. Now, distance to the mainland was also very important. We would expect colonizations to occur less frequently on more distant islands. So the nearer an island is to some source of species, the higher the rate of colonization or species moving from the mainland onto the island. So the implication is then that a large reserve is better, and a reserve which may be positioned close to a larger reserve or clustered together with other small reserves would be better because colonizations would be greater, and therefore larger numbers of species can be supported. Because often these reserves are going to be established in isolation and not really close to a source of other species coming out, this tends to lead to an emphasis on the size of the reserve. So the bigger the reserve, the better. So the advantages of large reserves: contiguous tracts of undisturbed habitat, greater habitat species diversity. So in a larger reserve, you're more likely to have different habitats like hills and valleys and so on, savannas and maybe forests. And so you would tend to have more species. Okay? You would minimize edge effects, and you would more likely maintain large enough viable population sizes for species to survive. But single large reserves are expensive to set up and hard to monitor and enforce. In particular, in a place like Trinidad or small island nations, single large reserves are often very difficult because much of the island has been disturbed for human purposes already. So single large reserves ecologically are the best, but there tends to be reality or socio-economic factors which militate against a single large reserve. Right, so Cymbalov and Abele responded to Diamond's principles in 1976, in the following year, saying that if we have a single large reserve, then it's much more likely that you're going to miss out on some sort of unique or rare type of, excuse me, okay, sorry about that. So we were talking about Cymbalov and Abele retorting in 1976, saying that the general idea of a single large reserve may not actually, in all cases, give you the maximum number of species. And the reason for that is because if you have a situation where there are unique or rare particular habitats, then they're quite often not likely to be found in a large area. So they might be contained in a small area. And so these unique habitats are most likely to have unique species, and they're quite often likely to have the species which are rare and which are conservationally important. So having a single large reserve which misses out these smaller areas which contain the unique species are actually a bit of a problem. And so they propose that actually having several smaller reserves may actually give you a better representation. And if those smaller reserves are joined together by corridors, then you're likely to have just as much resilience as you would in a large reserve. So that started a lot of toing and froing and so on. I must point out that Jared Diamond is an ornithologist, so he deals with animals, and particularly mobile animals. And mobile animals will tend to follow the island biogeography theory much more closely than, say, plants, which tend to be very much more stable or static and so on. So their advantages of small reserves, that's Cymbalov and Abele, was that they can protect a wider range of habitats, and they can therefore sometimes preserve a broader range of species. And they can maximize diversity conserved if located in areas of higher species richness. But their downsides are the strengths of the single large reserves. Those downsides are catastrophes can have a disproportionate effect on these smaller populations, which would exist in the smaller reserve areas, and that edge effects are going to have a big influence on these small reserves. So the Schloss debate was born, people arguing whether there should be a single large or several small types of reserves. And basically, it is a bit of a oversimplification, that's correct. There are probably elements from both arguments which are important. So if you are just trying to conserve simple species richness, then a single large reserve is probably best. But if you are trying to conserve rare species and species which are of great danger of going extinct as you've assessed with your conservation triage, then several small reserves are probably important just as well, just as much, if not more so, than a single large. So the effectiveness will probably vary from situation to situation and will quite often depend on how much land you have, whether you are looking at the largest number of species or particular conservationally important species, and where you can actually put your reserves down. So that balance between large numbers of species and species of conservation importance is particularly important, and we'll talk about it more as we talk a little bit more about on this lecture. So there's some of the principles of reserve design, which are basically generally recognized now, and these are coming out of the Schloss debate as well as many other debates, but they tend to concentrate mainly on the theories of island biogeography and the theories of metapopulation dynamics, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the thing to note is that they are all based on ecological principles, okay, and less so on socioeconomic issues and problems, except for that last one, humans excluded or humans included. But having said all that, ecological principles certainly are very useful for reserve design, and they do represent a step forward. They do tend to bring some sort of scientific rationality in whether we would choose to put a reserve here or there, and so on. I would have to emphasize, though, that these ecological principles tend to be subservient to socioeconomic principles. When it comes to land use, there are many different users of the land, and therefore quite often conservation tends to be relegated to a part of the landscape which nobody else wants. And that was certainly the case for Yosemite National Park, and also for Yellowstone National Park as well. But having said that, IBT is very useful for the reasons that we've got here on this slide. One thing should be noted, though, that the theory of island biogeography is a very good theory, but tends to be undertested in the real world. So the theory of island biogeography quite often is very difficult to test because it needs a fairly long period of time for a system to come to equilibrium, and before that happens, usually humans will intervene and change something, which makes examination of the theory quite problematic. So quite often IBT is untested, and there are untested predictions. But there are research projects going on at the moment which are looking at IBT and so on. Another thing to notice about these IBT and other ecological processes, in particular IBT, it emphasizes species richness and not species composition. So when we use island biogeographical theory to choose our reserves, we will tend to choose reserves which maximize the amount of biodiversity that we can get, and not special species. And sometimes that can be problematic, because if you have a little bit of disturbance in your reserve, quite often it will increase species richness, but it will increase the richness of species which occur everywhere with human disturbance, and it will reduce the number of species which are not able to tolerate human disturbance, and therefore species composition will be problematic. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about habitat fragmentation research, and in particular metapopulation dynamics. Now, some of you will have heard of metapopulation dynamics from doing the undergraduate course in biodiversity and conservation. We return to it here because it is sort of a natural step on from the island biogeography theory. It basically looks at how individual species can survive in a landscape, and therefore it is very important for understanding whether a reserve will cater for species which may be particularly conservationally challenged, or that your triage has shown needs to be concentrated on. Okay? For those of you who haven't done metapopulation dynamics, metapopulation theory is basically where we consider various small populations of a particular species as being linked together to form what is known as a metapopulation, or a population of populations. So each of the small individual populations contains a number of species, and those number of individuals of a particular species, and they will generally interact together, breed together, and create offspring together. But they will be linked to other small populations across the landscape by frequent emigration and immigration between the populations. Now, quite often the reason why you would have small populations of individuals of a particular species scattered across the landscape is because those species require particular habitat requirements, which may be very patchy across the landscape. So our species may require, say, lakes within an area, within a landscape, and they would need to disperse between lakes through the streams and rivers and so on if they wanted to emigrate or immigrate between those lakes. Okay? Or with regards to animals, there may be a particular habitat, like a ridge outcrop of rock or something like that, which is very good for a particular plant, for instance, and a population of that plant would live on that rocky outcrop, and the next nearest population may be a kilometre away, and it is a similar sort of population like that. And every so often seeds would be carried by birds from one outcrop to the next outcrop, and therefore you would have a metapopulation. The persistence of those populations within the different metapopulations would be determined by things like extinction and colonization rates and so on. Okay? So that's a distinction between metapopulation dynamics and island biogeographical theory, is that island biogeographical theory will lump the whole landscape together. So even though they may incorporate a metapopulation, it's only the metapopulation will describe the operation of that metapopulation. And if the island biogeographical theory protected area doesn't contain large enough number of these small populations to make up the metapopulation, which is stable, then that species will be lost. And it's only through metapopulation dynamics that we understand what is enough small populations, and also to understand whether a small population is able to generate more immigrants. In other words, it's a source population, or whether it is a sink population. In other words, it's supported mainly by immigration from another metapopulation. So all of those things need to be applied, but not to all species, but certainly to species which tend to have a patchy distribution across a landscape. So we need to take that into account. I wouldn't say that metapopulation dynamics replaces island biogeographical theory, but it certainly complements it. So yeah, where these metapopulation dynamics appropriate, where basically you would have that heterogeneous patches across a landscape where small populations live. So, taking into account island biogeographical theory, IBT, and metapopulation dynamics, we come back now to key issues for reserve design. Okay, and some of those issues are reserve size and shape. First of all, we need to know whether our reserve is large enough, and we can do that by looking at a species area curve to see how many species occur per unit area. If our habitat tends to have large populations of individuals in relatively small areas, then the reserve size can be smaller. If it is shown that some species, like trees for instance, need many hundreds of hectares to have a large enough population, maybe at least 200 to 500 individuals, then the reserve size should be that large. So species area curves can be quite good tools for estimating reserve size required. The habitat quality is important, whether the habitat has been degraded in terms of metapopulation dynamics, whether the habitat patch is a source habitat patch or a sink habitat patch. A source habitat patch is one which is very good for that species, meaning they will be able to breed and create more offspring than the habitat patch can cope with, so therefore the offspring will emigrate, they will emigrate out of the source patch, and they will be able and be available to recolonize other patches, including sink patches, which are patches which simply aren't good enough to support breeding which will allow the population to sustain itself. And so these sink patches will need immigrants from the source patches at times. So how do we determine appropriate size? Many different approaches are needed, and it really is determined quite a lot by whether you're focusing on individual species or species of conservation importance, and whether you're focusing on just straight numbers of species. We should probably also mention that genetic diversity is important in this area as well, and it feeds into the idea of minimum viable population sizes. We also need to take into account edge effects. I mentioned that briefly. Edge effects, quite often habitats or reserves are surrounded by human-dominated ecosystems or human-modified ecosystems, and those human-modified ecosystems can be sources for disturbance and problems in the reserves, and those are known as edge effects. So some things may be fires or invasive species like weeds, or animals like rats and so on, which can reduce the habitat quality for the reserve. So we want to minimize the amount of edge the reserve has. So that means an ideal reserve shape would be a circle, a solid circle. But and the least ideal reserve shape would be a long line which has lots of edge. Circles have minimum edge, lines have a maximum edge. So there would have to be, if you had to choose between a reserve which was linear and a reserve which was circular, you would go for the circular one. Disturbance regime must also be taken into account. Probably not in the rainforest, but in other ecosystems. Fire and hurricanes are a big part of the ecosystem of the reserve, and they need to be incorporated into that reserve. So if you have a ecosystem which requires periodic burning, for instance, for it to regenerate, then the reserve would need to be large enough so that part of the reserve can be burnt at any one time and allow it to regenerate with immigration from the other parts of the reserve, for instance. And here are some of the shape edge effects. So our orbicular reserve is best, and a line or a strip reserve is not so great. And there are some of the reasons written down there why. Alright, heterogeneity and dynamics. Heterogeneous areas will tend to have higher biodiversity, but then they will tend to have more metapopulation dynamics or patch dynamics within them than homogeneous areas. So there will be disturbance patterns. You would need to make sure that disturbance occurs to maintain patches, and you would need to make sure that species can move between those patches to recolonize in a metapopulation fashion. So generally, heterogeneity, which is quite often a measure of small patch scale dynamics like treefall gaps and so on, will need to take into account things like metapopulation dynamics. You also need to take into account the landscape context of the reserve. So what is the surrounding non-reserve land use? Is it industrial, residential? Are there humans within the surrounding area which are likely to infringe on the reserve? So what are their land use types? So for instance, in Trinidad, suburbs and areas of high density population are more likely to lead to human invasion into the reserve, because there are simply more numbers of people, and some of those people are more likely to want to trespass into the reserve. Areas which, say for instance, a pine plantation would be better as as a buffer or an edge around the reserve, because they tend not to be visited so much by people, but also they tend to modify and ameliorate the abiotic edge effects, like wind blowing into the reserve and so on. So all of these need to be taken into account when you're looking at what the reserve should look like in the context of the landscape. Edges of the reserve need to be taken into account. Quite often, reserves are based on socioeconomic reasons, and therefore the boundaries tend to be along fence lines or roads or railway lines, for instance, and therefore are very ecologically unreal. So you would tend to find plants and animals not recognizing those boundaries and needing to cross them, and that can be very problematic. An ideal reserve boundary is based on ecological considerations, whether it be a river or a ridge line or something like that, so that plants and animals will be less likely to want to cross those boundaries, and also those boundaries are much more recognizable on the ground. And also, as always, we need to minimize the amount of edge. Within the landscape, we need to connect the different patches, particularly in heterogeneous landscapes. And if you have a landscape where you have several small reserves, then it's best to have corridors which join up those several small reserves and allow plants and animals to immigrate between those small populations. And effectively you're setting up a metapopulation with your reserves, and metapopulation dynamics would come into play. So corridors can be planted or created or left even along linear landscape features, whether they be natural like rivers or ridges or depressions, or whether they be artificial like fences and roads and so on. They can all be corridors, and a corridor would basically be an area of land which is large enough or wide enough to enable plants and animals to move along it with a degree of safety and be able to move between different patches. Corridors are not always good. They certainly are good. I remember a place in North Queensland in Australia where they were planting up rainforest corridors between patches of rainforest that were left in an agricultural landscape, and they found very quickly evidence that small marsupials were using the corridors to move between these rainforest patches. Corridors, on the other hand, may be a problem. They may be a possible sink or an area of higher mortality for some species, particularly if the corridors make them more vulnerable to things like predation or hunting. So corridors need to be good types of corridors, and they may not be suited to all types of species. Buffer zones can be very important to put around reserves, and they will ameliorate edge effects. So you can read some of the reasons why buffer zones are important there. The problems with buffer zones are particularly where enforcement of land use is not strong, they can easily be taken over and destroyed by non-sympathetic land users, like clearing an area for short crops, for instance. And so buffer zones, if they are not part of the reserve itself, you rely on the integrity of certain land users for buffer zones to be maintained. And this is a model for buffer zones and different zones within that have been promoted by UNESCO. Alright, so how universal? Alright, I'm not too sure why that title is there, because we're coming on to the second part of key issues for reserve design. First one, reserve size and shape, and the next set would be network reserve systems. So this part of the lecture will acknowledge that single reserves, or reserves, are seldom established in isolation, and more so these days you would have several reserves in an area, and how those reserves can act together can greatly increase the amount of value you get out of those reserves for conservation. So being able to cluster your reserve systems or establish new reserves to act as stepping stones between more distant reserves is very important. So when we consider establishing reserves, quite often we would, these days we would consider establishing a whole network of reserves instead of just one reserve. And we would take into account things like metapopulation dynamics to increase our representativeness, to try and increase the connectivity of the different reserves, and to try and put the reserves in a position in the landscape which will maximize the chance that species can move between them. Also, these network reserve systems will be able to cover a more heterogeneous landscape and take into account metapopulations of particular species. Alright, blah blah blah. Where should the reserves be located? What criteria? So as I've said, taking into account different reserves will have a relationship to other reserves in the network, and that will impact on where they're located. What criteria? We may be able to incorporate IBT as well as metapopulation dynamics in a network. And reserve networks enables you to incorporate socioeconomic issues. In other words, being able to establish a reserve in an area where there is significant human use or disturbance, and managing for it. So allowing that human use or disturbance to coexist with the conservation aims with the network of reserves. Some of the problems with reserve networks is that quite often there is a minimum area problem, particularly if you are designing your reserve network for one particular species and the metapopulation dynamic requirements of that one particular species. Minimum area problems may be extended to other species existing in that reserve. So reserve networks, particularly if it's just catering for one particular species in a metapopulation dynamic situation, then they can be too small basically to maximize the number of species which can persist in them. Yeah. So generally, reserve networks should aim to incorporate island biogeographic theory, but they should also be able to incorporate some metapopulation dynamics for particular species where necessary. So the idea is flexibility there. And that flexibility can be assisted by using computers and computer algorithms and so on. Some of the keywords which you may come across would be gap analysis and reserve selection algorithms. And what you would do there, quite often using geographical information systems in which you can incorporate many different biotic layers and abiotic layers. So for instance, soil type, topography, rivers, roads, land use on the socioeconomic side, roads, population centers, and so on, can all be inputted into a GIS system and the landscape analyzed to show which areas would be best for a particular reserve or reserve network, and enable the reserve network which is most likely to survive in that particular situation to be created. Or gap analysis is also used to determine which species may not be represented in the reserve network at the moment, and therefore which extra reserves need to be made. So maybe you would have a rare species which only occurs on a particular type of habitat, and that habitat is not represented in reserves at the moment. You would need to establish smaller reserves to take into account that habitat and try and connect those to the reserve network or to one another, so that they may be able to, that species is catered for in the reserve network. Reserves can be evaluated by these computer-based methods for connectedness, total area of different habitats and therefore different numbers of species, maximum number of species and maximum number of rare species, and whether or not it's possible to connect heterogeneous populations and so on. Right, so gap analysis, a bit more detail. Data compiled for a region or conservation unit. Conservation goals identified. Are there particular species or a list of endemic species you want to conserve, or is it habitats that you're working with? Identify existing protected areas and what exists, whether species or habitats exist within those protected areas, and identify whether there are any species or habitats which are underrepresented in the existing protected areas. And then identify areas which could be added to the protected area network to fill those gaps. Okay? So a gap analysis is quite often carried out to ascertain whether the existing reserve network is good enough. So for instance, within Trinidad with plant conservation, it's pretty clear that in the existing reserve network, Serra del Aripo, which is the highest point in Trinidad, has significant numbers, in fact the highest numbers of endemic plant species in Trinidad, and yet is not in any reserve network. Even the lowest extractive reserves, it is not covered. So Serra del Aripo and surrounds probably needs to be incorporated into the reserve network in Trinidad and Tobago. So yeah, you've got your computer-aided GIS gap analysis. Reserve algorithms, I won't spend too much time on that. I have never used this myself, but apparently it can be very effective in calculating the largest number of species for the minimum expenditure of resources in meeting conservation objectives. And you would use systems like indexing, iterative techniques, and integer planning. Some of the limitations of computer-aided analysis is lack of baseline data. We still really don't know the needs of all the different species, for instance, and which selection algorithms should be used in different areas and so on. Quite often genetics is hidden, and we have no idea whether there is a genetic component in whether a population should be conserved or not. So we're coming back to it, many small versus few large. In a reserve network, which is best? It really depends. Different places it's going to be best for different areas. So different species may need many small. Other more widespread generalist species would need a single large. And it's quite often a combination of both which is required in your reserve network. Other factors which you probably need to consider: fragmentation, well, that's all part of it, but future fragmentation, climate change. Climate change is going to change habitats around the world, also in tropical areas, maybe less so in tropical areas, but the habitats will change still. And so if you have a species which exists at a particular elevation, you must design your reserve to allow it to migrate to higher levels if it is to survive in that particular habitat. Disturbance regimes must also be incorporated, and we've talked about that already. And also you must add human stakeholders and different conservation goals to that, whether you are aiming to conserve the largest number of species, whether you want to conserve one particular species, and if you create a reserve which is best for that particular species, it may disadvantage another species. So it can be a very difficult problem to generate a reserve area network. And one of the main things is that you can't do the same thing everywhere. There is going to be different biotics, different abiotics, and different socioeconomics in different places around the world. And all of those differences are going to mean that you will create a reserve network which is going to be different to different places or unique. Okay? Some of the things, though, which you probably should go back to is it's very similar to those original Jared Diamond principles. Make the thing as large as possible. Try to create a buffer zone. Maximize connectivity between different reserves. Buffer zones, again, that's number 4. Promote conservation easements surrounding the reserve. Try and get the human owners of those surrounding areas to buy into some sort of conservation easement. And you need to deal with social, institutional, political constraints. So next week we're going to talk about minimum viable areas and minimum viable populations briefly. So thank you very much. for listening.